You are listening to The Insider with Brian Lloyd. The opinions expressed are that of the individuals and can sometimes be of an adult nature.
On today's Insider podcast, we are joined by Roger Garcia, director of the Hong Kong Film Festival. He's in Dublin to talk about the Hong Kong action DIFFPix.
Yeah.
If I got that right. Roger, thank you very much for joining us.
Sure, nice to be here.
The selection of films that you've picked, and we'll put the full list up on the website, but I noticed there was a couple of interesting choices.
Mm-hmm. Way of the Dragon is an interesting movie because it's the only film that Bruce Lee completed as a director before he died, I think in 1973. So it was very interesting for us to show that film. I think it also reflects something of his experiences in America as a kind of an outsider, even though he was born in San Francisco. He spent his childhood in Hong Kong, and then he actually went back to the United States to make movies in Hollywood. He basically had a career in TV in the United States, and what was supposed to be his big breakthrough didn't happen.
Kung Fu.
Yeah, he came out with the idea of Kung Fu, as you know, and that went to David Carradine.
David Carradine, yeah.
So that really disillusioned him. And after that, he came back to Hong Kong, or went to Hong Kong. And you know, as the story is well known, he was rejected by Shaw Brothers and picked up by Golden Harvest. So The Way of the Dragon is a movie where he doesn't speak any English or Italian in the film, and he goes to Rome, basically, to help in a Chinese restaurant. But what he discovers is that the Chinese restaurant is being extorted by the mafia, I suppose. And he basically acts as the guy who repels the big boss, so to speak. It's in a sense, a little bit similar to the storyline of The Big Boss, which is one of his first films, and one of my favorites, shot in Thailand, with Han Ying-jie as the martial arts choreographer. So I think it shows Bruce Lee as the kind of a little bit of the outsider and the guy who's trying to deal with Western society. And it's, in one sense, one could say it's kind of nationalistic, but it's actually a bit more, I think, open than that. And Bruce himself, I think, was not a totally nationalistic guy, even though his films do speak of this, because he did have this pretty cosmopolitan background.
Yeah, that's something. It's funny that you mentioned that, because I mean, I don't think he was political in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
And you are right, yeah, a lot of his films, like especially like Enter the Dragon, I thought did have, I mean, even though that was his first American film, there definitely was quite a nationalist kind of vein running through it. I mean, I suppose the question I would always ask whenever I'm talking about Bruce Lee is that, you know, if he had survived, if he had gone to a certain age, I mean, where do you think his career would be? I mean, would he be sort of like Jackie Chan making these kind of comedies, or...?
No, I think Bruce was a serious martial artist and a superb filmmaker. I mean, he's a very narcissistic guy in one sense. If you watch The Way of the Dragon, you know, there are all these concerns going on about the restaurant, and what does he do? He strips and sort of flashes his pectorals in front of a mirror just to check out his body. I mean, this is an incredibly narcissistic view of the world. I mean, you know, the whole world could be falling apart, and there he is,
as long as he looks great,
looking at his rippling muscles. So but he was a great filmmaker, and actually The Game of Death, which was his last posthumous film, you know, he didn't survive to finish the film, is very interesting because it is an attempt to look at the different martial arts styles and also perhaps to try and synthesize them in some way. Because I'm sure you know the film very well. He fights his way up a pagoda. The pagoda is actually in Korea, and I think there are 5 or 7 stages.
Like that. Yeah.
And at the top is Abdul Jabbar
Karim. Karim
really
Abdul-Jabbar.
But on the way, he fights Korean guy. He fights Don Ignacio, who's one of the great Filipino martial artists, and so. It's an attempt to, first of all, perhaps assert his version of Kung Fu, which is Jeet Kune Do, but at the same time to show that he can learn from these different styles. So I think as a filmmaker, in the end, if he had survived, I think this in a sense, shows the way. I think he would be making a kind of perhaps Pan-Asian type of martial arts movie. But one that's grounded in a certain kind of realism, because anybody who basically admires themselves in a mirror and looks at their muscles and their high kicks is a guy who is doing real kung fu, not special effects kung fu. And he was not so much into the knockabout comedy style, which is the Jackie Chan style. I think for Bruce Lee, he would have been a guy who would have made films with quite a lot of tension in them, and perhaps a sort of thriller, but this type of display of different kung fu styles.
I mean, the interesting thing about sort of martial arts films, for the most part, is that, I mean, with the exception of Bruce Lee, obviously, and Jackie Chan and so on and so forth, they don't necessarily seem to kind of translate to Western audiences. But people who are aware of them are very, very, they're very, very much fans of it. But when you look at something like, say, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, the Ang Lee film, I mean, that was a beautiful film, and it did very, very well at the Oscars. I mean, do you think it's a case of the scripts don't match up with the action on screen, and that's why it doesn't translate to Western audiences? I mean, why do you think the majority of kung fu films and karate films, I think you would agree, do not translate to Western audiences?
Right. I think in one sense it's because in these movies, particularly the ones that we're looking at, and the real, what I call the real kung fu films, I think what we see there are films that are basically, their raison d'etre is really kung fu. Is the display of martial arts and the use of the body. It's not so much about the story. The story is a framework. Okay, you could say that about a lot of action films like Arnold Schwarzenegger, etc.
Of course.
But in many cases, things like romance, plots are kind of subordinate to kung fu. And perhaps one could say that it's one of the characteristics of the kung fu films of, say, the 70s and the 80s, that when they get into the plot is so convoluted that no one cares after a while. Because the plots are all about palace intrigue and conspiracies and backstabbing. But all of that goes by the board if, unless you're a real history freak of some sort. Because that is just a framework for a lot of guys beating the hell out of each other very well, and a display of kung fu. So in a sense, it's sort of like, say, a wrestling match. But for people who like action films, that is truly pure action in a sense. But I think for a more general audience that is looking for a story, a beginning, a middle, and an end type of thing, and a romance, maybe kung fu films are not that type of movie. There were attempts, of course, to mix the genres, and we do have a couple of those in our program of films. I think one of them is the Spooky Encounters, which is a great Sammo Hung film, which was the first time he went into making the ghost horror, ghost kung fu comedy film, which is really
it's quite a mix. It's quite a mix.
Subgenre in cinema. So there were attempts to do things like that. But you could see that if it had been a Hollywood film, it would have been either a comedy with action set pieces or an action film with some kind of comedy occasionally. But in the case of these Hong Kong martial arts films, actually they're more or less intertwined. And I think once again, a general audience which is looking for more of a story and something to get their emotions into, it's a little different.
It is a little different. The program that you've set out, I mean, I have to say, it is a fantastic one. I mean, if you had more time, I mean, would there be any more films you would have liked to have put in?
Yes, I mean, the continuum of kung fu and kung fu films is long and rich, deep and wide. So anything you do in this area can only be a snapshot.
Of course.
So we took a snapshot, essentially, of the kind of 80s. I think the films that we're showing are really those that are on the cusp of the CGI special effects, massive wire work revolution, the digital revolution that happened in the late 90s, I guess.
Yeah.
So what we see in these films are real kung fu. And yes, there are certain practitioners whom unfortunately we couldn't, for various reasons, include. One of the greatest filmmakers from Hong Kong is Lau Ka-leung, or Liu Jialiang, who made 36 Chamber of the Shaolin, and he made one of my all-time favorite kung fu movies, Dirty Ho, which Quentin Tarantino says is not about picking up women of the night. But it is truly a great masterpiece. It has Gordon Liu in it. I think people in the West would be familiar with him from Kill Bill.
Yeah.
And in fact, when they were making Kill Bill, I was called up by Tarantino's production guys because they were looking for the steps that lead up to the temple in Executioners from Shaolin, which is another Liu Jialiang film, and it's a great movie. I told them, look, this thing doesn't really exist in real life. It's a set from Shaw Brothers, and it doesn't exist anymore. But I told them to try and find the pagoda where Bruce Lee fought in Game of Death. I don't know if they did that in the end, but anyway. So Gordon Liu appears in that film, but Lau Ka-leung is truly one of the masters. I mean, there are two or three. One is Lau Ka-leung, and the other is Yuen Wo-ping, and they are two of the supreme martial arts choreographers, I think, of Hong Kong cinema.
It's just funny you mentioned there about the that the films that you've selected, they're on the cusp of the digital revolution, the wire work revolution that Yuen Wo-ping did on his fantastic work. I mean, I don't want you to say that it's lesser than, but I mean, do you have a lesser opinion of the wire works as opposed to, say, the more naturalistic stuff?
Well, I used to. But, watching some of Choi Hak's more recent works, I think, the Detective D movies that he's been making in China, and then more recently taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy, I think that the form has now evolved into its own art form.
Yeah.
Before it was something of a hybrid, and I'm actually quite a fan of real kung fu, and for a while I also studied Thai martial arts cinema. Panna Rittikrai was a guy I knew, and he did some of the Tony Jaa films and things like that. Unfortunately, he passed away at quite an early age a couple of years ago. But the Thai guys, and particularly Panna, is also one of the great martial arts choreographers of Asia. Yeah. Although he wasn't, unfortunately, well recognized. And he practiced real kung fu himself, real martial arts, Thai martial arts. And his are the sort of films where people are falling off 7-story buildings, you know. And he also helped create the person whom I think, in a sense, was a successor to Bruce Lee, was Jija Yanin, who is a great woman martial artist, and she made this fabulous film which Panna was involved in called Chocolate. And for those who are listening and watching, I truly recommend that film. It is an amazing homage. It's an amazing homage to Bruce Lee, but at the same time, it kind of crowns Jija as the successor of Bruce Lee, the kind of daughter of Bruce Lee, one could say. It's a fabulous, but unfortunately, she signed, and they have these ironclad multi-deal contracts, I guess, in Thailand or whatever. And so she was then put in a series of not-so-good films after that. But it was a fantastic, promising start. I was very enthusiastic about that film. And one thing I learned about Thai and Hong Kong martial arts is that Hong Kong martial arts is more horizontal as a form. Sure. Because when you do Hong Kong martial arts, you're practicing Hung Kyun, which is a southern style, where you have to stand in a certain position for hours on end. And in Thai martial arts, it's more vertical. That's why you have Panna having people falling off buildings, jumping from highways onto buildings and things like that. And it was very interesting as a contrast at the time in the 90s and the early, I guess the noughties, one calls, up to 10 years ago, of looking at Hong Kong martial arts and how it developed as a more horizontal form, and then the vertical form of Thai real kung fu martial arts. But now when we enter the age of the digital revolution and we have a lot of special effects and things like that, you'll see that Choi Hak is now making even more use of the vertical kung fu. He's always been into bamboo scaffoldings and sticks and things like that. But you see in his later works that he's making much more use of the vertical because he can with special effects and CGI and green screen and things like that. It was much more difficult before. People like Panner could do it because that was his life's work. But for somebody like Tsui Hark, in a sense, and I guess this is a debatable point, but it's an opinion, is that his kung fu was really brought up in the Hong Kong style of the horizontal, but now he's gone both horizontal and vertical. As well.
Where do you see? I mean, Hong Kong obviously has such like a vibrant, film industry. Shaw Brothers and Golden Harvest and so on and so forth. I mean, what do you think? Where do you see a future? I mean, do you see a future for kung fu films and these type of films, martial art films?
Yes, I do. I mean, people say that, does Hong Kong cinema still exist? Because everybody's making films in China. We now produce about 50 films a year, of which probably half of that number are probably co-productions with China. A lot of our guys are in China now. Tsui Hark is basically based in Beijing, I think, now. And he makes most of his films in China. And there's a reason for him to do that, is because the budgets there are bigger, the audiences are huge, and he has at his disposal the sort of special effects houses, maybe from around the world, but also in China, which enable him to make these pretty spectacular films, I think. So I would say that, yes, there is a space for martial arts movies, and I think that it will continue to evolve. It's evolving now in China, I think, in the special effects way. I'm happy to say it's led by a Hong Kong filmmaker, Tsui Hark, because he has a vast background and experience in all of this stuff. And gradually these skills will translate and transpose onto the mainland Chinese styles as well. And I think they have guys who are coming up. There's a movie by Teddy Chen, a Hong Kong filmmaker, made in Hong Kong with Donnie Yen, and called Kung Fu Jungle, which came out earlier this year. There's a guy, I'm sorry, I don't know his name offhand, but there's a guy in there who fights Donnie Yen. He's the bad guy. He constantly pops up even though you think he's dead. It's one of those. But there's just like this half-hour, final confrontation scene where these two guys are really fighting on a freeway, a high motorway, with trucks and everything. And I think that really shows that the mainland, some mainland talents are really quite impressive.
Very much so. Yeah. I mean, have you seen The Raid? I mean, are you familiar with The
Raid?
Yes, Gareth Evans. Yeah. I mean, what did you make of that?
I think that's a pretty good film. I think it draws on. It's quite derivative.
It is, isn't it? Yeah, very much so.
I don't have any problems with derivative works. I mean, it does show the influence of kung fu, let's say Hong Kong martial arts. There is a certain element of real martial arts in all of that. Indonesian martial arts fighting is something I'm not particularly familiar with, so I can't say how genuine, etc. it is. It doesn't have to be, of course, but I think that it's a pretty credible effort. And
definitely.
And then there was a Raid 2, and then it went international, and it's all made by a Welshman, of course.
That's correct. Gareth Evans,
who now lives. I think he moved to the States.
I think he moved to the States, but he was living in Indonesia for quite a long time.
Yes, there are. They're actually. I mean, it's all part of the Celtic Brotherhood, isn't it? There are actually 2.5 Welsh filmmakers in Asia who are rather good. One was Gareth Evans, who made The Raid. The other is a guy called John Williams, who works in Tokyo. I actually produced a film of his once.
Oh, really?
And he's fluent in Japanese, and he makes films in Japan. And then there's this other guy, Rydian Vaughan, who is actually a Taiwan movie star in Taiwan. He's half Welsh and half Chinese, and he's in this street movie called Monga, which did quite well in Taiwan and in international film festivals. So, but now Gareth Evans has taken himself out of Asia. I guess you could say there are only 1.5 Welsh investment working in the Asian.
He may come back
industry.
though. I mean,
he may come back.
He's been threatening to do a third raid film. So.
Oh, really? Okay,
yeah,
that's good. Well,
he said he wanted. He said, I think I interviewed him, and he said he wanted to do one. He wanted to do one film in the US, and then he wanted to try come back and do a third raid film. You mentioned there international film festivals. You of course you're the director of the Hong Kong International Film Festival. Can you give us a little taste of what you've got coming up or anything for the new year?
Our festival is usually takes place in March. It does take place in March. We are the oldest film festival in Asia, actually. We celebrate our 40th edition next year.
Wow.
So we're working on the program now. I think we will probably have some events that would celebrate Asian cinema, of which we are one of the pioneers, and also Hong Kong filmmakers, of which we still have some great guys, Johnny To, for example, and Wong Kar-wai, people like that. I think Peter Chan. They are still active, although many of them make films in China.
China, of course.
But they are also still involved in Hong Kong cinema. So I can't say too much at the moment because we're still working on it.
Of course,
but it will be a kind of celebration, I think.
That's really cool.
Not a huge extravaganza, but something I think that I hope will be quite meaningful.
Very good. Okay, Roger Garcia, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.